In section B, we will begin to look at the relationship between conspiracy and actus reus. Here we have a copy of the Pennsylvania statute on criminal conspiracy. As you can see, it says agrees in there twice in paragraphs 1 and 2, and then in the subsections we have overt act. So those things will pretty much work together in order to give us the overt act, or the actus reus, I should say, of the conspiracy statute in Pennsylvania. Let's look at Commonwealth versus Azim. Azim was the driver of a vehicle in which James and Robinson were passengers. They spotted another young man on the street. I think they asked him for the time, asked him for some money, something very common. This is a common set of circumstances, common facts. He did not respond. They got out, they assaulted him and robbed him. Now, while this is going on, Azim sat at the wheel of the vehicle with the engine running, the lights on and the doors open. And James and Robinson, the assaulters, immediately fled the scene in the vehicle driven by Azim. Azim drove them away. He, in a sense, drove the getaway car. Now, proof of this agreement would equal a conviction. That would be appropriate. Now, overt acts are sufficient to prove a corrupt federation. And circumstances relevant to proving a conspiracy include association with alleged conspirators, knowledge of the commission of the crime, presence at the scene of the crime, participation in the object of the conspiracy. And the reason for this is that usually these agreements are not in writing. It's not the nature of these kinds of events. There is no agreement to point to. So the courts look for these other indicia to come up with an overt act. The holding of the court in this case was, once a conspiracy is established and upheld, a member of the conspiracy is also guilty of the criminal acts of his co-conspirators. So let's think about poor Azim here, huh? Maybe, many of us have been in situations in which perhaps we should have done something differently to either escape some dire circumstances or to blunt the actions of others. And for whatever reason, maybe we didn't do it. Maybe we didn't have the moral courage, which seems to be a big problem in these cases. What if Azim just simply panicked and sat there, didn't know what to do? What do I do? If I drive off and leave these guys, I guess I'm the next one to take a solid beating. What if he decided after the assault to assist in the getaway? He just sat there stunned, but later, after they got back in the car, he decided, now I'm a getaway driver. I better get these guys out of here as fast as I can. What if Azim was a passenger and simply remained in the car? And, if this thing had gone further south, conspiracy would be the least of Azim's troubles. Let's say that they had killed this victim. We all know where that would leave Azim if he's the driver of the car. Now we'll look at Commonwealth versus Cook. Again, moral courage is wanting here. Dennis Cook was charged with conspiring with his brother Maurice to rape a young woman. They encountered the victim in the neighborhood. They had a long chat. She'd been looking for a boyfriend. Her boyfriend wasn't at home. She sees these guys. They decide to strike up a conversation with her. And they're all talking casually, as casual friends might, or acquaintances might. As they're walking through the woods to go to the store, the victim fell. And when the victim fell, Maurice jumped on her, handed his belt to Dennis, and raped the victim. Maurice was charged with rape, and Dennis was charged as an accessory to rape in addition to conspiracy to commit rape. And we know conspiracy, it was a heavy, heavy crime. It carries a heavy sentence. And Dennis was convicted of conspiracy, but that conviction was reversed. And here's what the court said in Cook. They said that this was more of a chance social encounter than a preconceived plan between the defendant and Mr. Cook, so they could not find an agreement there, any preconceived design that these two had come up with. They said that there was no attempt by the brothers to conceal the fact they were socializing with the victim. They said that the brothers each showed the victim identification and that it was Mr. Cook, not the defendant, who suggested they go to the store and who chose the path to the store. The path was reasonably direct, and the victim fell to the ground by herself. Now, the defendant may have aided and abetted a crime, but that does not establish conspiracy, particularly where the evidence shows that prior planning did not take place as an inherent part of this crime. Neither association with a criminal nor knowledge of an illegal activity constitute proof of participation in a conspiracy. And this gives rise to one of the great questions of American jurisprudence. What's the difference between complicity and conspiracy? Here, Dennis Cook is an accomplice, but not a conspirator. All conspirators are accomplices, but not all accomplices are conspirators. Was there spontaneity here? Yes. Was there an agreement here? No. So accomplice liability is present, but no conspirator liability. Let's look at a conspiracy agreement. At common law, conspiracy is formed at the moment two persons actually agree. The essence of a conspiracy is the agreement, and a slight majority of states, including Pennsylvania, require some overt act in addition to the agreement. And criminal agreements, as I said, are rarely recorded. Often they're not explicit. So nod of, why say yes when a nod of the head will do. As a result, conspiratorial agreements can be proved circumstantially. But the agreement must be actual. There has to be a real meeting of the minds. They have to actually and subjectively agree to do the unlawful act. Here we see the bilateral theory of conspiracy at work. The defendant solicited John Ragsdale to commit a robbery. Ragsdale pretended that he was interested, but his main interest was in drawing the defendant out. In fact, Ragsdale informed the police of the planned robbery, and when Ragsdale and the defendant met at the intended victim's residence, they were arrested. The defendant was convicted of conspiracy and appealed. Now, here we can distinguish between unilateral and bilateral theories of conspiracy. A conspiracy conviction could stand under a unilateral conspiracy statute here because that allows for only one alleged conspirator to agree to the commission of an offense. As illogical as it might sound when you say that one person can agree and a second person is not necessary. This jurisdiction, however, in Pennsylvania, both have bilateral conspiracy statutes requiring the actual agreement of at least two conspirators. The defendant's conspiracy conviction was reversed based upon these grounds. Now, in a unilateral conspiracy theory jurisdiction, the language usually says something like this: if one or more persons agree, or a person is guilty of conspiracy if he agrees. And in a bilateral jurisdiction, the language usually sounds something like this: if two or more persons agree, or if a person agrees with another person. Now let's understand how this works. If A asks B, an undercover police officer, to participate in a burglary, B pretends to agree in order to gather evidence and arrest A. There is no agreement in a bilateral jurisdiction, so you cannot charge the bad guy here or bad actor with conspiracy because these bilateral jurisdictions require an actual agreement between two parties. If, however, of course, after talking to B, A then recruits C for the same crime and C agrees, there is a conspiracy between A and C. Now, co-conspirators' motivations may be different, but that does not affect the fact that there is a conspiracy. For example, if A offers B $500 to help him kill V, and B agrees, both are guilty of a conspiracy to commit murder, even though A was interested in revenge and B was only interested in the money. In Kilgore v. State, we look at the scope of the agreement, and we look here at whether or not this was a wheel or a chain conspiracy, and that will go ultimately to whether or not the hearsay exception for conspiracy comes into play, which means that the prosecutor then could get a conviction. So we had 3 attempts on Norman's life. Oldacre, Benton, and Carden was one attempt. They failed. Kilgore, Berry, and Carden also failed. Kilgore, Price, and Carden, they were successful. Now, the prosecutor joined them all in one conspiracy in order to take advantage of that co-conspirator's hearsay exception. But there was no community of interest since these were different attempts. There were 3 chain conspiracies, essentially. They look like spokes in a wheel, but there was no rim holding all the spokes together. So there was not one general criminal enterprise. And since they were not all co-conspirators, there could be no hearsay exception, and the conspiracy conviction was reversed. And finally, in Braverman versus the U.S., you can have one agreement with multiple offenses. And this is an example of how there's some pushback by the courts at times, that they're not always happy with the prosecutor piling on with conspiracy charges. Braverman and other petitioners were indicted and on 7 counts, each charging a conspiracy to violate a separate and distinct Internal Revenue law. But the court said one agreement between co-conspirators cannot be taken to be several agreements or several conspiracies merely because it envisions the possibility of violating several statutes rather than one. Now, next we will be looking at some defenses and take a closer look at Pennsylvania conspiracy law in Section C.